Nice deep burgundy stain color like Hugh Hefner's bathrobe. Alright, today I'm building a whiskey side table. So the design of this table is to have a mitered frame go around the top of the table, and if you know anything about wood movement, you know that could spell disaster. If that wood expands and contracts, it could blow those miters apart. So I'm starting out cutting up some plywood a little bit oversized so I can veneer it, and that plywood core with the veneer should help lock that expansion contraction to a minimal amount so it doesn't blow my miters apart. Alright, so to create my shop sawn veneers, I'm using a Laguna Resaw King bandsaw blade. It's a 3/4 inch carbide tooth blade, and this blade is my preferred method for shop sawn veneers, especially in hard materials like white oak and wingay and that kind of stuff. So everybody asks where I got that tape dispenser for dispensing the veneer tape, and I buy most all of my supplies from veneersupplies.com, and I'm using Titebond's cold press veneer glue for this project. All right, so while we're waiting for the veneer to dry on the top, I started to work on the drink rail. Now the drink rail is a decorative bead. It's a 3/8 inch wide bead that goes around the table. And aside from it being decorative, it also has a little bit of a function to it. After you've had a little bit too many sips of whiskey, it kind of helps guide your hand to make sure that you are sitting your whiskey glass on the tabletop instead of the edge where it's going to fall off and spill on the floor. So it's an important piece for the serious whiskey drinker. All right, so to create this bead, I set up a beading bit at the router table and ran my 3/8 inch thick stock through it. All right, so to attach the drink rail to the top, I want to make sure there is a really clean transition, that there's no gaps, and to make sure this little piece of molding doesn't warp or bend out of place, and also to hedge my bets that my miter won't open up with any kind of expansion contraction. So I am creating a little bit of a half flap here. So I'm basically creating a rabbet around the edge of the tabletop, and then I'm going to create a matching rabbet on the bottom edge of the drink rail. So that way it kind of creates a little bit of a half flap so they nest together, creates a lot of glue surface, nice glue bond, and just a really clean transition. I have found that my table saw makes the cleanest, most accurate miters over the miter saw. So I use that as my preferred method. So basically I just mark my line and then sneak up on it as I go and then just work my way around the tabletop. All right, so to attach the drink rail, I'm going to use glue and a headless pin from the brad nailer, and that headless pin will just disappear. Now, I am being very conservative with the amount of glue that I'm using because this piece is going to get stained that dark burgundy color, and I don't want the glue to interfere with the stain soaking into the wood. So I'm being very, very careful with the amount of glue that I use. I don't want to have to deal with any squeeze out that I don't have to. All right, so now the whole tabletop is going to get wrapped in a decorative apron. And so to ease the transition, or to make a nice transition between the apron and the drink rail, I'm just beveling that top edge. So in the room that this whiskey table is going in, the client has a built-in cabinets, and those cabinets have like this little cloud lift detail. It's not a true green and green cloud lift because it's basically made with a stop and start point using a cove bit on a router table, but it was close enough, and so I decided to use that kind of idea and mimic it in the table. So I created a little bit of a cloud lift on the bottom edge of the apron. So to cut the cloud lifts, I basically made a plywood template and went to the router table with a pattern bit and routed out the shape. All right, and our decorative cloud lift apron parts are going to get glued and pinned with the headless pin nailer to the tabletop. To set the spacing so the drink rail sits above the apron, I'm just going to use a couple of little spacers here to rest those on as I glue and nail them in place. All right, we're moving on to the legs. So I milled up some stock and set up a stop on the miter gauge so I can make sure I cut all the legs to the same length. Ooh, almost botched that cut. But anyways, I got my shop-made tapering jig set up here because the inside faces of the legs are getting a taper on them. All right, so the bottom shelf is going to be joined to the legs via a little dado in the legs. So what I've done here is I've cobbled together a little cradle here to cradle the tapered side of the leg, so that way I can cut the dado in it. And then that dado blade is tilted just a little bit. So basically I measured the angle of the taper that we just created in the legs, did a little math, and figured out how far I needed to tilt that blade to cut the dado so that way the shelf stays level. So the pointy parts of the shelf are going to interfere with the fit, so I'm just going to trim those guys off. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. I don't think I can get that fit any better. All right, so I got one last little bit of joinery to do, and that is to create a little bit of structure to support the top of the legs. I want to be able to take the top off from the base so that way it makes it easier to stain and finish. All right, so I'm basically just cutting the fit, and then I'm going to use the domino to create my joinery. And then to make assembly a little bit easier, I glued it up in some sub-assemblies. So I glued the sides together, and then once that glue dries, I will glue the entire frame and shelf together. And if you wiggle your jaw back and forth while you're putting the part in, it'll go together better. All right, one last thing to do is to cut some trim for the bottom shelf. So I just need to take a angle measurement here, and then I'm going to cut a test piece just to make sure I have the saw dialed in, and then I'm going to test each leg to make sure that each leg is the same, because potentially they might have got a little bit different when I hand planed the saw marks off. That angle might have changed, but we're going to find out for sure, and I'll adjust as I go as I cut each piece. All right, I'm going to hold each piece up and just mark it with a pencil, go to the saw, cut it, and then I'll test fit it. And if it doesn't fit properly, I'll go back to the saw just to sweeten it up. I'm always going to try to start a little bit fat and then sneak up on it as I go. And a technique I like to use when I'm trying to sneak up on the fit is I will have the blade raised up high enough to where I can just butt the workpiece up against the side of the blade, because the carbide teeth stick out a little bit wider than the blade, and then I will finish the cut. So that way I'm only taking off just a tiny amount, just the amount that the carbide teeth is sticking past the main body of the blade, just to take a tiny little bit off. Right, and I'll attach these the same way, a little bit of glue and the headless pin. And then again, trying to be conservative with the glue so I don't interfere with the stain. I know that's just the bottom, but I like how clean and perfect that turned out. All right, so I have a custom dye stain here. I color matched it to my client's existing furniture. It is a water-based dye, so I wet the wood to raise the grain and then sanded it back smooth. So now I'm just going along and I'm going to do the bottom side and then flip it over to do the top side. And each time I do this, I'm going to let the dye soak into the wood for about 5-6 minutes or so. And while it's soaking in, I'm going to make sure that it stays wet. So if a part starts to look like it's starting to get dry, I'm going to kind of re-wet that area just to make sure everything stays wet, uniform, and give it a chance to soak in. All right, I'm doing one piece at a time because I want to be able to keep track of how long the stain stays on there and not get in a rush to where I let it sit too long. If you let it sit too long, it could turn out darker than the stain sample I provided the client. So when I made the stain sample, I let it sit for about 5.5 minutes or so before wiping it off. And so I want to do the same here, so that way it's a consistent color. All right, and to wipe the excess stain off, I'm using a damp rag that I've wringed out really well. I want to make sure there's no excess water in the rag, but I do want it a little bit damp. I have noticed over the years that if I use a dry towel, that sometimes it will leave a harsh wipe mark line that you can see where I wiped the wood. To where if I use a damp rag, that it is a little softer and does not leave hard lines when I wipe the stain off. I'm going to let this dry overnight before applying a finish. I want to make sure that any kind of moisture has completely evaporated away. And then I'll show you the end product here. All right, and there is our completed whiskey table. Thanks for following along.